The year was 1943 and the sun hung low over the Norfolk Naval Base in Virginia. The air was thick with anticipation, the sounds of busy workers and humming machinery filling the atmosphere. A man named Herman Butcher, a Nazi soldier captured by the Allies, stepped down from the gangplank. He had just crossed the Atlantic Ocean, and nothing could have prepared him for what awaited him on American soil. Butcher had heard the propaganda, the countless speeches and pamphlets filled with assurances of American inferiority. But as he stepped onto the docks, everything he had been told about America seemed to shatter in an instant. He could hardly believe his eyes. Men and women of all races worked together side by side, something that went against everything the Nazis had drilled into their soldiers' minds. The dock workers were a mix of black and white, all laboring together to unload crates and boxes of military equipment. Butcher could hardly process the sight. This wasn't just about the racial integration, something alien to the ideals he was raised with. It was the sheer scale and efficiency of the operation. American docks stretched out as far as the eye could see, with cranes unloading ships at a speed that would put the German ports to shame. And yet, this was just the beginning. You see, Butcher and his fellow prisoners had been conditioned to view the United States as weak, divided, and inferior. Propaganda painted a picture of a nation teetering on the brink of collapse, its people fractured and unprepared for war. But when they arrived at Norfolk Naval Base, everything they had believed began to crumble before their eyes. There were no signs of disarray here, no chaos, no sign of the decay they expected. Instead, what they saw was a nation so confident in its power that it could afford to treat its enemies with respect and dignity. Imagine this: hundreds of prisoners of war, enemy soldiers, men who had just fought against the United States and its allies, standing in the same camp as civilians side by side. Men who had just been on the front lines were now offered comfort and care, something that could only be described as a stark contrast to the way prisoners were treated in Nazi-occupied Europe. Butcher witnessed something he could not understand at first. American soldiers, white and black, were working together in the same facilities. A German officer was being treated by a black American doctor. This was not just a cultural shock for Butcher. It was a blow to the very foundation of the Nazi racial doctrine that he had been raised on. What would have been an impossible situation in his homeland was just another day in America. To them, it wasn't just about fighting a war. It was about showcasing the strength of their way of life. This wasn't just a fight for territory or resources, but for an ideology that made them stand above the fascist nations they were battling. And the prisoners were about to witness it firsthand. The Nazi belief that the German people were destined to dominate the world was not just a political theory, it was a racial theory as well. They believed that the Aryan race was superior to all others. That is, until they stepped onto American soil. What they saw, felt, and experienced there shook them to their core. The prisoners were given everything they needed: shelter, food, medicine, and more. They were not viewed as just prisoners, but as human beings who deserved respect. In a world dominated by warfare, this was an anomaly. The reality they faced in these camps defied everything they had been taught about how enemies should be treated. Butcher, as he later wrote in his memoir Behind Barbed Wire, could not believe what he saw in the United States. Prisoners were given access to food that was of better quality than what many German civilians had at the time. They had access to medical treatment that was far superior to what they had received in Europe. The American military followed the Geneva Convention in every respect, ensuring that the rights of prisoners were upheld. And perhaps most surprisingly, they were treated with dignity. Butcher witnessed American soldiers sharing meals with the prisoners. There was no animosity, no anger, just a curious sense of peace between two groups that had been at war just a short time ago. For the prisoners of war, this was a difficult reality to process. They had been taught their entire lives that America was the enemy, yet here they were, experiencing something more baffling than battlefields or explosions, a nation that treated them like people. Butcher wrote about the surreal moment when he was allowed to sit in a mess hall with American soldiers, eating the same food, sharing the same space. There was no sign of hate, no sign of the brutality they had been conditioned to expect. Instead, Butcher and his fellow prisoners were met with warmth. The food, the medical care, the respect, they were all part of a plan. The Americans weren't just defeating the Nazis on the battlefield, they were winning the hearts and minds of their enemies in the process. This ideological battle would continue throughout the war, with American values slowly and quietly chipping away at Nazi beliefs. What the prisoners didn't know at the time was that this experience, this exposure to American culture and life, would be more damaging to their beliefs than any bomb or bullet. The ideals of freedom, democracy, and respect for all people would become more powerful than any weapon the Allies could wield. The Nazis had a strict view of what the world should look like. World where only the superior would rise to the top, and others would remain beneath them. Yet in America they saw a different world. A world where individuals, no matter their race or background, could live together and work towards common goals. This was the beginning of an ideological transformation for the prisoners. What they saw in America made their worldview, crafted by years of Nazi propaganda, seem obsolete. Butcher would go on to explain in his writings how the American treatment of prisoners made them question everything they had been taught. It wasn't just the material abundance that stunned them. It was the kindness, the humanity that the Americans showed. For Butcher and many of the others, this was a revelation. It was something they could not reconcile with their previous understanding of the world. As the days passed, these men, who had been trained to believe in the superiority of their nation and race, were exposed to a different way of life, one that not only rejected their ideology but thrived because of it. This was not a quick or easy transformation, but over time the seeds of doubt were planted, and as the war raged on, these doubts would grow. Butcher's experiences were just one small part of a much larger story. All across America, in camps and factories, German prisoners were exposed to the same reality. They saw how the American way of life worked, how democracy, despite its flaws, functioned in ways that Nazi ideology simply could not comprehend. As they worked side by side with Americans, they realized that their master race ideology was nothing more than a fantasy. The harsh reality of the Nazis' failed beliefs was evident every day in the lives of the American workers and soldiers they encountered. Through these encounters, German prisoners came to understand something vital. The strength of the United States didn't come from its weapons or its soldiers. It came from its values of equality, liberty, and justice. These values would eventually win the war, not only because of the superior firepower of the American military, but because they offered a vision of the world that was both powerful and deeply attractive. As these prisoners of war returned to Germany, many of them were forever changed by their experiences in the United States. They had witnessed firsthand what a democratic society could offer, and for many of them, the idea of a world where people could live in freedom, regardless of race or background, became a new ideal, one that stood in stark contrast to everything they had fought for. By the end of the war, as Germany lay in ruins, the lessons learned in American prison camps would resonate across the globe. The victorious American ideals would inspire generations to come, showing that the true strength of a nation isn't in its military power alone, but in the values that bind its people together. As the months dragged on, the German prisoners continued to work side by side with Americans day in and day out, and the experience only intensified. At Camp Hearn in Texas, something unimaginable to the prisoners began to unfold. They were not just given work assignments, they were given roles. They were asked to govern themselves. This to them was absurd. In their eyes, enemy soldiers had no right to autonomy, no right to make decisions about their lives. But this was not the way things were done in America. Prisoners elected their own representatives, managed their schedules, and in many cases were allowed to contribute their labor to the war effort. The very idea that they could organize their own lives was a concept so foreign to their Nazi-trained minds that it left them in stunned disbelief. The transformation that was taking place wasn't just material, it was ideological. The American treatment of prisoners, their respect for the Geneva Conventions, their fairness in distributing rations, and even the way they treated them with basic human decency, none of it made sense according to the Nazis' racial hierarchy. Here in America, the captives were treated with dignity. Even the most cynical of them could not deny that the American system, so contradictory to everything they had been told, was not only effective, but humane. At the same time, they began to witness the freedom of speech that Americans enjoyed, something that was unimaginable in the Third Reich. On Christmas Eve in 1943, the Germans were invited to participate in a Christmas service alongside American civilians. This was a crucial moment, one that would forever alter the prisoners' view of their captors. They watched as American mothers, who had sons serving on the front lines, sang Christmas carols in German for them. This act of kindness was incomprehensible to the men who had spent their lives believing in the brutality of the enemy. As they sat in those services, listening to hymns sung by people whose sons were fighting to destroy their homeland, the prisoners began to grasp the enormity of what was happening. The American way of life was not only surviving, it was thriving, and in a way that showed no signs of the division and chaos they had been taught to expect. The sight of American women driving trucks, working in factories, and even piloting military planes was another blow to Nazi ideology. In Germany, women were kept out of the workforce, their roles confined to household duties. But here in America, women were taking on roles that defied their own societal constraints. They were pilots, mechanics, and even leaders. This was a direct challenge to the very ideas that had led to the war in the first place. The German prisoners saw firsthand that America was not a nation ruled by fear, but one of cooperation, of diverse peoples working together toward a common goal. The prison camps in America were not just places of confinement. They were institutions of exposure and education. At every turn, the prisoners were forced to confront the gaps in their worldview. As they worked in American factories, they witnessed the efficiency and productivity that made American industry a powerhouse. It was a world of continuous operation. Factories that never stopped, where workers took pride in their jobs and even competed for bonuses. Every corner of the American industrial complex seemed to run on precision and efficiency, something the German soldiers could barely comprehend. They marveled at the scale of production in the United States. At the Alcoa aluminum plant, where prisoners worked alongside American workers, they saw how much was produced in a single day, far more than the German factories could even dream of producing in a week. This was a world where waste was minimized, where innovation was constant, and where the work ethic was unparalleled. For many of these prisoners, it became clear that the strength of America lay not in its military prowess alone, but in its ability to produce, innovate, and outlast any challenge. Yet, the most jarring realization came when they saw American society for what it truly was, a place of contradictions. Prisoners worked alongside African Americans and Mexicans, and while the prisoners didn't fully understand it at first, they began to realize that this integration of races was something that simply did not exist in their homeland. In America, racial lines were blurred in ways that had never been allowed in the Third Reich. They witnessed a society in which different races and ethnicities were able to coexist and work together, not out of necessity or forced compliance, but out of choice and mutual respect. In addition, there was an openness to ideas and criticism that the Nazis had long suppressed. Prisoners were able to hear broadcasts and read newspapers that openly criticized the American war effort. This was so far removed from the controlled narratives of Nazi propaganda that it seemed unreal. The prisoners saw that in America, public debate was not only tolerated, it was encouraged. American soldiers had the freedom to criticize their leaders, to question decisions, and to even express doubts about the war, all without fear of punishment or retribution. To the German soldiers, this was incomprehensible. It went against everything they had been taught about authority and obedience. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of their experience was the realization that their own ideology was collapsing before them. The harsh race-based hierarchies they had been taught to believe in were being systematically dismantled, not by force but by reality. They had believed in the superiority of the Aryan race, the supposed inferiority of all other races. But in America, they saw people of all races working together, thriving together, and living in a way that demonstrated the strength that came from unity, not division. By the time the prisoners were repatriated back to Germany, the impact of their time in America had left an indelible mark on them. Many of them returned home with a new understanding of what a society could achieve when people worked together, regardless of race or background. For some, it was a turning point, one that made them question everything they had once believed in. These men who had come to America as enemies left as transformed individuals. They had witnessed a different way of life, one that showed them the true meaning of strength, the strength to treat others with respect, to work together toward a common goal, and to embrace diversity as a source of power, not a threat to it. The lessons learned in America by these German soldiers would not only shape their views but would contribute to the rebuilding of Europe in the post-war years. They would carry these lessons with them into their new lives, some even emigrating to America, where they would contribute to the country that had so deeply impacted their thinking. They had been enemies, but through exposure to American democracy, they had become advocates for the very values they had once sought to destroy. As the years went by, the German prisoners, many of whom had witnessed the dismantling of their own beliefs, gradually settled into their new realities. Some returned to Germany, forever changed by what they had experienced in America, while others found themselves returning to the United States, becoming part of the very society they had once fought against. The transformation they underwent wasn't just intellectual, it was deeply personal. Many who had once clung to Nazi ideologies now questioned the very foundation of those beliefs. Some, like Hans-Georg Gartner, would go on to live in America under an assumed name for decades, raising children and building families in a land that had once been their enemy. The American approach to handling prisoners was nothing short of revolutionary in the context of wartime. Unlike the Germans, who had viewed prisoners as mere assets to be exploited, Americans treated their captives with a level of humanity that was almost unimaginable. Prisoners, even those who had been soldiers in the brutal German Wehrmacht, were given the opportunity to transform, not just physically, but ideologically. The American military, through deliberate policies and careful planning, allowed these men to experience something entirely different from the totalitarian world they had come from. One of the most significant elements of this transformation was the opportunity for education. The American military understood that education was the key to changing hearts and minds. And so, the German prisoners were given access to an incredible variety of educational resources. They could attend classes in American history, agriculture, and even learn about democratic governance. This wasn't just a ploy to re-educate them, it was an honest effort to expose them to ideas that had never before been allowed under the Nazi regime. The libraries stocked books from German authors that had been banned, works that painted a picture of a different kind of world, one that celebrated democracy, free markets, and the value of human dignity. These were not the kinds of books they had been exposed to before. In Germany, the very act of reading something that contradicted the official narrative could lead to severe punishment. But in America, the prisoners were free to read what they wished, to explore ideas that contradicted everything they had been taught. The power of exposure was immeasurable, and for many of these men, it led to a shift in worldview that was impossible to ignore. But perhaps one of the most significant aspects of their American experience was the way they interacted with their American captors. The relationships between the German prisoners and the American soldiers who guarded them were often cordial, even friendly. This wasn't the cold, impersonal military hierarchy they had been accustomed to in Nazi Germany. Instead, these prisoners were treated with a surprising level of respect. Some American soldiers even went out of their way to make life easier for the prisoners, offering them small comforts, like extra food or access to recreational activities. This kindness was both perplexing and jarring to the German soldiers, who had been taught to believe that Americans were the epitome of everything their government despised. As the prisoners worked in various industries, from agriculture to factories, they witnessed firsthand the industrial might of the United States. This was no longer the enemy they had imagined. The mechanized, efficient, and productive system they saw before them was one that had the capacity to not just win a war, but to completely reshape the global order. The factories they worked in weren't just places of labor. They were symbols of American ingenuity and strength. At Alcoa, where they worked in aluminum production, the prisoners witnessed the staggering productivity of American factories. The vast amount of raw materials that were processed in a single day was enough to make any German factory worker feel humbled. The efficiency was staggering. What had once seemed like a distant, abstract concept became a tangible reality that these prisoners could no longer deny. In Germany, resources were always scarce. Workers labored under harsh conditions, often with little reward. But in America, there was an abundance that was almost unfathomable. At the cotton gins in Texas, where the prisoners worked side by side with Mexican-American and African-American laborers, they saw how a system based on cooperation and mutual respect could generate prosperity on a scale they had never imagined. This wasn't just a country that produced more. It was a country that did so with dignity and respect for the people who made it all possible. And then there was the American attitude toward race. The prisoners, many of whom had been steeped in the racial ideologies of the Nazis, were forced to confront the reality of racial integration in the United States. In their eyes, the idea that people of different races could work side by side, live together, and even share equal rights was not only absurd, it was a direct challenge to everything they had been taught. Yet the prisoners were unable to deny what they were seeing. They watched African-American soldiers work alongside white soldiers. They saw Mexican-American laborers treated with dignity and respect. They worked with people of different races in a way that would have been impossible in Nazi Germany, where the very concept of racial equality was a taboo. In the face of this exposure, many of the prisoners began to change. They could no longer reconcile the ideals they had been taught with the reality they were witnessing. The values of equality, democracy, and cooperation that permeated American society began to seep into their consciousness. They had come to America as enemies, but they were leaving as men who understood that their former beliefs were not just wrong, but dangerously so. They had been given a glimpse into a world that was not ruled by fear, hate, or division. They had witnessed, in real time, the power of democracy to transform even the most entrenched ideologies. As the war drew to a close, the prisoners were sent back to Germany, but their experiences in America never left them. Many returned home with a new understanding of what it meant to be free. Some went on to emigrate to the United States, seeking a new life in the country that had changed their perspective forever. The lessons they had learned during their captivity would guide them as they rebuilt their lives. And many of them would go on to become active participants in the rebuilding of their own country. But it wasn't just the individual prisoners who were affected. The entire post-war world would be reshaped by the lessons these men had learned in America. The relationships forged between former enemies became the foundation for the transatlantic alliance that would emerge in the years following the war. The seeds of the Marshall Plan, the rebuilding of Europe, and the democratic transformation of Germany were all planted in those camps, where former enemies came to understand the power of American democracy. In the end, the victory of the United States over Nazi Germany wasn't just won on the battlefield. It was won in the hearts and minds of the men who had once been the enemy. The American way of life, the principles of freedom, democracy, and equality, proved to be the most powerful weapon in the arsenal of democracy. These values, demonstrated not through propaganda but through real, everyday actions, transformed not just the soldiers who fought the war, but the very nature of the world that would emerge after it. As the post-war years unfolded, the incredible impact of the American treatment of German prisoners continued to ripple through history. These men, who had once been dedicated soldiers of a ruthless regime, would go on to contribute to the rebuilding of Germany, their perspectives fundamentally altered by their experiences in the United States. They had witnessed the strength of American democracy, the power of racial integration, and the value of individual freedoms, all principles that would shape their future. Interactions with the world. One of the most striking legacies of this transformation was how these former enemies integrated back into a democratic society. For many of the men who had been detained in American prison camps, the experience was eye-opening. They had been forced to confront the flaws of the ideology they had fought for, and in the process, they began to realize that there was another way to live, one grounded in cooperation, opportunity, and respect. As a result, some of these former prisoners chose to remain in the United States, choosing not to return to the devastated Germany they had left behind. In fact, thousands of former prisoners would go on to live in America after the war. Between the 1950s and 1960s, many former POWs who had been held in American camps applied for and received American citizenship. This wasn't just a case of people seeking refuge. It was a reflection of how deeply their worldview had shifted. For some, it was the beginning of a new life, one they would never have imagined when they first set foot on American soil as enemies. They saw in the United States the promise of opportunity, equality, and a chance to be part of something greater than themselves. In Germany, These men brought their newfound perspectives with them, influencing the direction of post-war society. Many returned to key positions within the country, playing pivotal roles in the creation of the modern German state. Whether in politics, education, or industry, they used their experience and understanding of democratic values to help rebuild their country. It was a transformation that reached far beyond the individual and touched the very fabric of German society. The former prisoners of war were integral in shaping a democratic Germany, one that was destined to become a key player in the European Union and on the global stage. But the lessons of those prison camps were not just limited to the individuals who experienced them. The broader relationship between Germany and the United States would be forever changed. The bonds that were forged in those camps, bonds formed through shared experiences, hardship, and a fundamental understanding of each other's humanity, helped lay the foundation for what would become the strongest bilateral alliance in history. The US and Germany would go on to cooperate in rebuilding Europe, with the United States leading the way through the Marshall Plan, which not only provided financial aid but also offered a model for democratic governance. The transformation was gradual, but it was undeniable. The American system of democracy, based on principles of freedom, equality, and human dignity, proved to be more powerful than any military force. The prisoners who had once believed in the superiority of the Nazi regime came to understand that it was not just militarily defeated, but ideologically discredited. In its place, they saw a new way of life, one that would not just reshape Germany but also the world order that would emerge from the ashes of the war. As we look back on this moment in history, we can see that the true victory wasn't just in the military victories, the battles fought, or the cities rebuilt. The real victory came in the transformation of ideologies. The Nazi ideology of racial supremacy, which had justified so much of the suffering and destruction, was dismantled not just through force, but through the demonstration of a better way to live. The prisoners who arrived in America as enemies left with a profound understanding of the ideals that the United States held dear, an understanding that they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. In the end, what made America's victory over Nazi Germany so profound wasn't just its military might, but its ability to expose the world to a different vision, one where freedom, democracy, and cooperation were the guiding principles. And in that, the former prisoners who had been transformed by their time in America became living proof of the power of those ideals. Their stories of transformation and redemption are a testament to the strength of a society that refused to be defined by its enemies. Instead, it chose to show the world that the true path to victory was through understanding, respect, and the simple belief that all people deserve dignity, no matter who they are or where they come from. The lessons learned from these remarkable transformations resonate even today. We live in a world where ideologies continue to clash, where divisions run deep, and where the struggle for freedom and justice is ongoing. The story of how the German prisoners were changed by their exposure to American society reminds us that sometimes the greatest victories are not won by fighting, but by showing the world a better way to live. And that in itself is the true power of democracy. As we reflect on the incredible journey these prisoners took, from enemies to allies, from followers of a dangerous ideology to advocates of freedom, we are reminded that history is not just about the battles we fight, but about the ideals we choose to live by. The transformation of these men is a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of democratic values. Their story is one of redemption, hope, and the unshakable belief that, even in the face of the darkest times, there is always the possibility for change, growth, and a better tomorrow.